I'm Chris Stevenson here to talk mechanics and character creation in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. In the first 3 videos in this series, I covered general topics, attributes, and skills. In the 5th and final video, I'll be covering advantages and disadvantages. This video is about disciplines, the signature supernatural powers of the kindred. Because I'm addressing character creation, I'm only going to be talking about the first 3 dots of each discipline, not higher level powers or amalgam powers, because those won't be available to you at character creation. One basic principle to keep in mind when thinking about what you're going to do with discipline dots is that you don't have to pick the highest level power available when you buy a new dot in a discipline. Most of the time you will. The higher level powers tend to be better. But if you want heightened senses and you want sense the unseen, you can just select those 2 1-dot powers if you have 2 dots in Auspex. You don't have to take the 2-dot power. Disciplines are where vampires really differentiate themselves from mortals. Well, apart from the being blood-sucking monsters thing. So it's usually important to make sure that your discipline powers do what you want and work when you want. In this regard, it is important to pay attention to the roles required for disciplines. Your discipline roles are going to be a discipline plus an attribute. Disciplines that can be resisted are most often resisted by attribute plus attribute roles, with composure plus resolve being the most common. This means that when resistance is applicable, the target of the power will often get to roll 5 dice. If your discipline dice pool is smaller than that, the power will probably fail. And if your discipline doesn't require a dice roll to activate the discipline, but needs to work in conjunction with a skill roll, you also need to make sure that you have a big enough dice pool that that skill roll will work. For example, potence and combat rolls. And having your disciplines fail all the time or not come into play all the time is probably going to feel really lame. So strongly consider having an attribute of at least 3 in whichever attribute is tied to your most important discipline powers. And consider how your role of attribute plus discipline encourages you to pour multiple dots into some disciplines. Speaking of pouring multiple dots into a discipline, another reason to do so is how character creation works compared to spending XP. Disciplines during character creation are mostly pretty straightforward. You get a 2-dot and a 1-dot, both in clan. But Predator style gives you a 4th discipline dot. That 4th dot might be in a discipline you don't have, or it might buttress one you already have. Having your Predator style discipline be a 3rd dot in an in-clan discipline is worth 3 times as much experience as getting your 1st dot in a 3rd in-clan discipline. You could also pick up the 2nd dot in an in-clan discipline, which saves some experience, or a 1st dot in an out-of-clan discipline, which saves a little bit of experience, but also lets you avoid needing to get 1 step blood-bound to another vampire in order to pick that up. The Predator-style discipline dots are really the only place during character creation that this sort of arbitrage between the 2 systems is applicable. But it is worth considering because if your storyteller plays rules as written, V5 is very stingy with experience points, so you're going to want every experience point you can get later. Well, with that out of the way, let's talk about the disciplines themselves. I'm just going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Animalism. Animalism can give the character a familiar, let them sense the hostility of another person, summon and communicate with animals, gain additional sustenance from feeding off of animals, or cow another mortal or vampire's beast. Summoning and directing animals is probably the signature low-level animalism power. Charisma is used to summon, and manipulation to direct. Charisma is also used to cow mortals with Quell the Beast, although Quell is pretty darn weak unless a critical hit is scored. So while your traditional animalism using clans like the Gangrel and the Nosferatu are not traditionally highly skilled social predators, these signature animalism powers do rely on using those social attributes to make their rolls. Auspex. Auspex can allow a vampire to see the supernaturally hidden, to have heightened senses, receive premonitions, read auras, or tap into another's senses. Auspex primarily relies on wits and resolve, which one, depending on whether the character happens to notice something or is actively searching for something, just like the normal skill rolls with those attributes. But checking in on a blood sorcery ward, which you can do with Sense the Unseen, requires intelligence. Both 1-dot powers here are solid. Heightened Senses dodges the need to invest in attributes, as it only requires rolls to avoid being overstimulated. Sense the Unseen, on the other hand, wants lots of dice, because it will always be opposed by another discipline. 2-dot power Premonition can be an extremely useful tool for both the player and the storyteller. There's nothing quite like a ready-made tool to shove the coterie back on track. Classic Auspex power Sense the Soul, however, can be very hit or miss. It's imposed by a Composure plus Subterfuge roll, so the more likely you are to need a supernatural power to figure out what's going on with someone, the less likely that power is to actually work. And Composure plus Subterfuge is a roll that you should expect many vampires to be quite good at, thus significantly limiting your ability to rack up multiple extra successes on Sense the Soul and get the information you want. Celerity. So next up is Celerity. In this series, I haven't gone too much back to older editions, but note that Celerity and the other physical disciplines feel significantly different from in prior editions of Vampire, because like all the other powers, they now have individual powers at each level rather than just this powerful automatically stacking effect. Celerity in V5 can grant supernatural balance, is some help against firearms, increased dexterity, straight line speed, and walking on walls. When Celerity requires a roll, it uses dexterity, but most of the uses of this discipline require no roll at all. However, in exchange for this, the scope of most Celerity powers is very limited. It isn't all that often that a vampire needs to roll to keep their balance, or can't find cover in a firefight, or make general dexterity checks. Not dex plus skill, but just dex. Note that the fleetness power limits the value of Cat's Grace, so I would avoid the latter if you're going to take the former. Also, note that it is not until 5 dots that a character can do something like search a house at high speed or just do generalized tasks at high speed. The lower level applications of Celerity are all limited to specific circumstances. Dominate. Dominate is the power of directly commanding. It can make a target forget, follow a single word command, follow a slightly longer command, follow an implanted command, or rewrite memories. These commands are limited to very straightforward ones that require no judgment on the part of the target. The lowest level Dominate powers are charisma based, while manipulation is used for the 2 and 3 dot powers. Dominate is most commonly resisted with an intelligence plus resolve roll, and lower generation vampires can shrug the power off by spending a willpower, which I think is the only mechanical benefit left to being of lower generation. However, that's only against another vampire. Most mortals get no roll at all against Dominate, making it extremely effective against them. Fortitude can make a vampire physically and mentally tough, or mitigate aggravated damage to superficial. Although Fortitude has historically existed as a physical discipline, the mental aspect of it in V5 is not to be overlooked. For example, Fortitude as you would probably intuit, helps you weather blows, but it doesn't let you avoid getting hit in the first place. But this isn't true of the 1-dot power Unswayable Mind, which adds extra dice to your pool to resist social and mental assaults, from mundane seduction and intimidation to the use of vampiric disciplines such as Dominate and Presence. A couple of extra dice can make a huge deal in those rolls. Extra dice are very important in V5. Only the most august of predators will be able to easily overcome your 7 or more dot dice pool to resist Dominate. And the second level power Toughness reduces all but the most catastrophic superficial damage to 1. For example, if you would normally take 4 damage from a gunshot, you reduce that to 2 with the power, and then because it's superficial, it gets halved to 1. As another plus, Fortitude does not require any roll to activate. The first 2 dots of Fortitude are purely defensive, of course, but they are powerful nonetheless. Obfuscate. The most unchanged of the disciplines with the transition from V20 to V5, Obfuscate lets you stay silent, stay hidden, move hidden, blend into a crowd, or avoid electronic detection. Unlike most disciplines, Obfuscate does not by default involve a roll. However, Wits plus Stealth can be an important combination to have, because Obfuscate is broken when you do things like accidentally make a lot of noise. So mundane sneakiness can still be important. How important? It's going to depend on how much your storyteller requires you to make those sorts of rolls. And note that Wits is also the attribute that you use to keep your Obfuscate up in the face of the Auspex power Sense the Unseen, which in the V5 core book is the only way for someone to supernaturally pierce your Obfuscate. Potence, on the other hand, has a drastically different feel from the scaling of automatic successes on combat rolls than it used to be, much like physical discipline compatriots Celerity and Fortitude. Potence lets you inflict severe damage on mortals, leap far, increase unarmed damage, perform feats of strength, quickly drain mortals, and climb well. Like Obfuscate, Potence generally does not directly involve a roll. It does, however, require hitting with an unarmed melee attack, which means making a successful Strength plus Brawl check. Indeed, most uses of Potence are completely useless if you cannot win a combat roll using Strength plus Brawl. Also note that many of the Potence powers, such as Lethal Body and Brutal Feed, are relatively ineffective against other vampires. Potence makes you good at ripping apart mortals in combat once you can already hit them with that Strength plus Brawl check. If that mortal defeating is not what you're looking for, you might want to look at the more cinematic Potence options, such as Soaring Leap to run and jump across rooftops, or Prowess, which allows you to pick up, knock down, and throw heavy objects, which are all feats of strength. Plus, the damage bonus from Prowess is in full effect against other vampires. Presence can make a character supernaturally alluring or frightening, or imbue their kiss with even more supernatural pleasure. Presence has the advantage of generally operating unknown. Persons who have been affected by your presence won't know that unless they have the Auspex power Sense the Unseen. The most basic function of presence is the 1-dot power Awe, which typically does not require a roll. Instead, it adds your dots in presence to Charisma plus Persuasion or Performance checks, or any other appropriate Charisma check. That can be a very broad array of pools, and notably includes your generic Siren hunting pool. Just a little bit of presence makes it much easier to generate a big dice pool for social checks than is usually possible for physical checks. Alas, when the target has the ability to resist presence, your roll is based on manipulation, so you can't just pile onto charisma. The other 1-dot power in Presence, Daunt, adds only to intimidation checks. But note that this does include intimidation checks that are not charisma-based, such as a strength plus intimidation check to try to physically intimidate someone. Daunt can be helpful, but Awe has much broader applications. The 3-dot power Dread Gaze can sometimes substitute for Daunt, but it is much more of a blunt force weapon. But it does use charisma for the role. Still, it may be an appealing option instead of entrancement, depending on how your storyteller plays entrancement. By the flavor description, entrancement seems very potent. Make someone fall in love with you for the night with a roll based on charisma. But love is not stupidity. And whatever the flavor description, the actual mechanical effect of entrancement is to add presence to social dice pools against the subject, which Awe already does for most charisma rolls, although not those manipulation rolls. So how much mileage you get out of entrancement will depend heavily on how much your storyteller plays up the description of the power over the mechanics of the power. You might want to double down on the alluring or the scary aspect of presence, but it can be a much more versatile power to go one way at 1 dot and the other way at 3 dots. Or, if making mortals addicted to your feeding on them isn't your cup of tea, for example, you don't want to devote that much time in session to managing a blood cult, keep in mind what I mentioned earlier, and you can take a second 1-dot power when you get the second dot, so you can have both Awe and Daunt. Protean. One of the most powerful and versatile powers, Protean can let a vampire see in the dark, be light as a feather, do extra damage in unarmed combat, sleep in the earth, or change shape into an animal. None of these powers require rolls, unless you're using Weight of the Feather when unexpectedly falling. But fellow 1-dot power Eyes of the Beast is way more useful anyway, unless you plan on jumping and falling off of tall buildings a lot. Like Potence, 2-dot power Feral Weapons doesn't require its own roll, but it does require winning Strength plus Brawl combat rolls. It is a big deal when you hit, however, as Feral Weapons laughs at Potence when it comes to dealing damage to other vampires. With 2 extra damage and the elimination of damage halving, Feral Weapons effectively increases your damage by 4 or more in a game where most vampires won't have more than 6 health. Additionally, Earth Meld remains one of the strongest survival tools a vampire can have. There are few Level 1, Level 2, Level 3 powers stronger than the combination of Eyes of the Beast, Feral Weapons, and Earth Meld. However, Protean is effectively restricted to the Gangrel and to the very limiting Farmer Predator style. It's technically also available in the Bloodleech Predator type, but your storyteller really shouldn't allow that in most games, as it's going to end your character very quickly. So while Protean is very strong and very versatile, it's only a select few characters who have it as an option, at least during character creation. Blood Sorcery. The main line of Blood Sorcery powers deal with directly manipulating vitae, yours or others, turning your vitae corrosive or poisonous, learning about others from their blood, increasing the hunger of other vampires, and temporarily increasing blood potency. The primary benefit of which is getting an extra die on other discipline rolls. Blood Sorcery powers directly use a variety of attributes, most commonly intelligence or resolve. Scorpion's Touch requires strength, but it usually requires a successful melee attack anyway, so you probably needed strength. All of the Blood Sorcery rituals, and there are a lot, require intelligence. However, with the relative lot of options for Blood Sorcery comes a relative lack of power for individual options. Many of the powers and rituals have very weak effects given the cost. Well, that is all of the low-level disciplines from the core book. Everything up through level 3, the most you can start with as a fledgling during character creation. You have some leeway to pick and choose your disciplines, but you don't have a ton. You can't just pick anything like you can with skills. You have to stay within those in-clan disciplines, plus whatever you get from your predator style. But within that leeway, again, a big point of emphasis is pay attention to which dice rolls, if any, are required for those disciplines. Disciplines can be a defining part of a character, and usually you're going to want to ensure that when it comes time to use them, they don't fail because you didn't put enough dots in the right attribute. Or you have a lot of one-dot disciplines that require rolls, meaning that even if you have a decent attribute, your net roll is still not going to be very impressive. That's it for this episode. Stick around for our 5th and final episode where I'll be talking about advantages and disadvantages. Until then, if you found this helpful, please like or subscribe below.